Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment video. This week I am covering the very strange case of George Smith and the murder of Michael Bainbridge, which took place in Hetton-Le-Hole in 1873. I hope you will find it interesting. For some reason, some of the information about the past lives of those involved in this week's case was quite hard to find, so some of it will be quite basic. George Smith was born in Derbyshire in around 1837. He had moved to Hetton-Le-Hole around 14 years before the murder took place and had married Mary White in around 1861. Mary already had one child, a daughter, and George and Mary had at least 7 children of their own. George worked as a miner and was fond of a drink and was also known for treating his wife quite badly. He was described as being a very tall man, standing at around 6'1". Michael Bainbridge, the victim, was also born in around 1837 and was said to be around 36 years old at the time of his death. His place of birth is unknown. He was married with several children. The exact number is not stated. The family may have lived in Caroline Street in Hetton-Le-Hole at some point. However, in 1873, they were living in Barrington Terrace and lived close to the Smiths. Michael also worked as a miner. Before we go any further, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. It really is appreciated, and it is completely free to subscribe. It doesn't cost you any money, but it really does help to support the channel. And I would just like to add, as I always do now, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. On the morning of the 15th of September 1873, George Smith argued with his wife Mary before he left for his day's work. The argument seems to have been about Mary's daughter. When he arrived at work, he was a little late and spoke to another of his workmates, telling him he would have been there sooner, but he had been fighting with his wife. He left work at around 4 p.m. and met with a friend named John Taylor. John told George some of the details of a murder that had recently taken place in Darlington. When he had finished telling him, George said, "There might be a murder in Hetton before the night is out." He then went to the nearby public house and stayed there until 7 p.m, when he went home very much the worse for the drink. When he arrived at his home in Barrington Terrace, he told his wife and her daughter to get out of the house. At first they didn't go, but they left a few moments later. Mary also took the younger children with her. Mary and her older daughter Barbara returned a short time later, but once more George told them to get out, so they went to a neighbour's house. George followed them out of the house, and in the street he saw Michael Bainbridge. Almost at once he began to shout abuse at him, accusing him of being his wife's lover and asking to fight with him. Michael called him a coward, saying he would never fight a man because he would not win. Michael's wife then came out and told George there was no improper behaviour between her husband and his wife. George then said he wanted to fight with another man by the name of John Ray. He was in an adjourning yard with his brother-in-law, Joseph Simpson, and he told George to keep away, but he did not, and then he began to fight with the two men, and they both knocked him to the ground. Michael, who had still been in the area, briefly joined in the fight until George got to his feet and went back to his own home, where he went inside and locked the door behind him. Barbara, George's stepdaughter, looked in the window and saw him take his gun down from the wall and load it. She shouted to the men in the street that he had his gun, but they did not take any notice. George opened the window and again argued with Michael, and Michael threw a brick at him. George moved away from the window briefly before returning and pointing his gun across the road. He aimed at Michael and fired. Michael and another man fell to the ground, but while one man got back up, Michael did not. Neighbours ran to his side and he was carried to his home. He opened his eyes once and looked at his wife but did not speak. Michael Bainbridge died less than 10 minutes later. George had locked himself inside his house and was pacing the room with his gun in his hand, shouting that he would shoot any man that came near him. And when PC Longstaff and PC Browning arrived, they were unable to get inside, with George threatening to shoot them as well. Sergeant Thompson arrived a short time later and he spoke to George, eventually getting him to agree to open the door as long as he sent the crowds of people away who were in the street. And when George opened the door, Sergeant Thompson forced his way inside and the police officers were finally able to get their man. George said he meant them no harm and did not resist when they handcuffed him and removed him from the house. The inquest was held at the Shepherd's Inn in Market Street in Hetton, and I have to admit that I've only ever known this pub as the Shepherd's, but the name no doubt changed over the years. In charge of the hearing was Coroner Maynard. George, on hearing the details of the case, stated, "It was accidental. I don't know how it was done. Me and the deceased never had any words, and the gun went off. I don't know how. I was drunk at the time, and I don't know anything about it." Sylvester Wilkie of Hetton-Le-Hole said he had identified the body as being that of his brother-in-law Michael Bainbridge, adding that he had heard George Smith threaten him many times before the night of the murder. Barbara White said she was 15 years old and lived with her mother and stepfather in Barrington Street in Hetton-Le-Hole. Barbara said that on the morning of the murder, George had argued with her mother. She said the argument had been about her, but she did not explain what had been said. She said just before George left for work, he had hit her mother. She said no one else had seen this happen. She said George had returned home around 7 p.m. He told her he did not plan to take care of her anymore and she was to leave. She said she left with her mother and the younger children, but they returned a short while later. George had not changed his mind and again told them to leave, and they went to a neighbour's house. She said her mother had often had to go to the neighbours' houses to get away from George when he was violent towards her, and she had sometimes gone to the home of Michael Bainbridge, where his wife had taken care of her, adding that George had often threatened to shoot her mother. She said after they had gone into the street, George had followed them. There he saw Michael and began to argue with him. She said he swore at him and called him knock-kneed. He tried to get him to fight, but she said Michael told him, "I will not come up there beside you." She said Michael's wife was passing and she spoke to George, telling him if he said anything more about her husband and his wife, she would split his head open. She said Mrs. Bainbridge then threw some coal at George. He was not happy, but she said he shouted that he would not strike a woman. She said Mrs. Bainbridge then tried to get her husband to come and fight with George, but he would not come up. She said after this, two men named Joseph Simpson and John Ray came out of a yard close by and they began to fight with George. She said while they were fighting, Michael came up and kicked him while he was on the ground. She said with her mother's help, they were able to get George back into the house, but as soon as he was inside, he once again told them to leave. She said as she was leaving, she looked in the kitchen window and saw him take the gun down from above the door. She said when he took the gun down, he started to shout at the men outside, saying he would shoot them. She said she was around about 2 doors away from their home before she shouted out that George had his gun, but Michael said he has done that many a time and did not seem worried. She said it was true he had often taken the gun down and threatened to shoot himself or her mother. She said she then saw Michael throw a brick through the window and then heard the sound of a gunshot and she saw Michael fall. She said she'd also seen the end of the gun pointed out of the window before it was fired, and she believed it had been around 10 to 15 minutes after the brick had been thrown before the gun was fired. She said she'd never heard George threaten Michael in the past and had never seen them fight, but they had had words before, and Michael had taken the gun from George 6 months earlier when he had said he would shoot her mother. She ended by saying he had always been drunk when he said he would shoot himself or her mother, and it had not been long since her mother had stopped him from taking his own life. Anne Ray said John Ray was her husband and they lived next door to George Smith in Hetton-Le-Hole. She said on the night of the murder, George had come to their house saying he wanted to fight Michael Bainbridge. She said Michael had said, "What's the matter with you? Get back into the house, you fool." She said George then pulled his shirt off and challenged Michael to fight him, but he refused. She said Mrs. Bainbridge was passing and she asked George why he could not leave her husband alone and why he kept saying bad things about his own wife, saying she was quite sure that her husband wanted nothing to do with his wife. Anne said after this he came and asked her husband John to fight and said he would make him fight. She said her husband and her brother Joseph then went into the street and began to fight with George. She said Joseph was knocked to the ground first and then George. She did not see Michael join in with the fight. She said George's wife and stepdaughter got him back into his own house and he shut the door. She then heard Barbara shouting that George had his gun. She said after this, she went inside her own house with her husband and brother and they locked the door. A few seconds later, she heard a gunshot. She said she ran to the window and looked out and saw Michael fall to the ground. She said she heard George threaten to shoot him before, and she had also heard him say he would take his own life or that he would murder his wife and be hung for it. The other men, who had all been on Barrington Street in Hetton at the time, all gave very similar evidence to Anne Ray, all agreeing with her version of events, which was slightly different to the evidence given by his stepdaughter. However, it seems that most agreed that it had been at least 10 minutes after the brick had been thrown before George had shot Michael, and I did not find any actual evidence given by either John Ray or Joseph Simpson. Dr. Adams of Hetton-Le-Hole said he had been called to the home of Michael Bainbridge on the night of the murder at around 7:10 p.m. By the time he arrived, Michael was already dead and there was nothing he could do for him. He said he also performed the post-mortem and had found many shot pellets inside the body, including several that had penetrated the heart, and it was this, he said, that had been the cause of death. John Taylor said he had met George in Hetton on the night of the murder. He said they had talked for some time and George was quite tipsy. He said he had talked briefly about his wife and he had advised him to go home. He said they had then talked about the recent murder in Darlington, and George had said to him, "Perhaps there might be a murder at Hetton tonight." George said he did not take much notice, thinking it was just a drink talking. He said George left just after this, and he ended by saying that when he was sober, George was a quiet, peaceful man. Sergeant Thompson of Hetton said he had been called to George's home at around 7:30 p.m. He found the door locked and George refusing to let anyone in, saying he would shoot any man who tried to get in. Sergeant Thompson said he told him, "Don't make a bad job worse," and George replied saying, "What I did in self-defense. 3 of them were kicking me." He said he'd looked in the window and saw George behind the door with the gun in his hand. He said it was some time before he was able to persuade George to open the door, telling him that the crowd would be sent away if he let him inside. Sergeant Thompson said as soon as the door was open, he quickly went inside and took hold of the gun. George said it was empty and he found this to be true. He said he then charged him with the willful murder of Michael Bainbridge and he was taken to the police station. It was said that around 5 months prior to the murder, George had been very violent towards his wife shortly after the birth of her last child. She had sent her daughter to Mrs. Bainbridge's house and asked her to come up. She had done this, but her husband Michael had also come with her, and he was drunk at the time, as was George, and the 2 men had argued, with George accusing Michael of being involved with his own wife. This had resulted in Mary Smith going to the police and making a complaint about George, and he'd been bound over to keep the peace. It seems this had been when George had begun to accuse Michael of behaving improperly with his wife and when his dislike of the man had started. No further evidence was given, and the coroner, in summing up, said it was for the jury to decide if the truth had been told about the length of time between the fight taking place and the gun being fired. If they believed this to be true, then George had had ample time to control his temper, and it could not be seen as self-defence. The jury, after retiring for a very short time, returned a verdict of guilty of willful murder against George Smith, and he was committed for trial. I did not find any details of a funeral for Michael Bainbridge, and it is very unlikely that the family would have been able to pay for a funeral, so this was most likely a pauper's funeral. And although I cannot be sure, it is possible that Michael would have been buried in the churchyard of St. Nicholas's Church in Hetton-Le-Hole. I did not find any evidence of a headstone for Michael anywhere in the churchyard. Sadly, the church burnt down several years ago. However, graves do still remain in the churchyard, as I do have family buried there, and there were still graves there when I last visited a couple of years ago. Just prior to the trial, the grand jury rejected the charge of willful murder and reduced it to a charge of manslaughter. And also just prior to the trial, Mary Smith went to the church to ask for assistance for herself and her children, and it was stated that every help would be given to her to help her to support her family. The trial took place at Durham in December of 1873 before Mr. Justice Honeyman. George pleaded not guilty to the charge. As is often the case, the majority of the evidence at the trial is the same as that given at the inquest, so I will only include the new information. Thomas Laverick of Hetton said he had been in Barrington Street on the night in question. He had seen the fight earlier, and he had seen Michael hit George when he was on the ground. Later, he had been standing next to Michael Bainbridge opposite George's house. He said he saw George in his kitchen and he heard him say something, but he did not know what. But after this, Michael threw a brick through his window. He said a few minutes later he heard a gunshot and saw Michael fall to the ground. When cross-examined, he said he could not be truly sure how much time had passed from the brick being thrown to the gun being fired, but it was certainly longer than a minute. The defence spoke to the jury, stating that this was a case where there were many doubts, and that it was also a case where the firing of the gun really had been done accidentally. However, he said if the jury could not truly believe this, then they must think of the great provocation the prisoner had received, making this a case of manslaughter and nothing more. He then called some character witnesses. And Thomas Lowry of Hetton said George was a quiet, well-behaved man and that he had known him for 2 years. And William Clennell, also of Hetton-Le-Hole, said he had also known George for around 2 years, and he said that George had been given the name the Quiet Man, and that this suited him well. I did not find any details of the prosecution summing up. However, the judge spoke to the jury, stating that if they believed the gun had been fired accidentally, then they should acquit the prisoner. However, he said they must consider that the gun was fired from the opposite side of the road and that Michael was shot in the heart, which was somewhat strange had it been an accident. He then said that they must consider if the gun had been fired in self-defence, as the prisoner claimed, but he could not see any reason for this. Yes, there had been a fight earlier, but this was over and there was no reason for George to feel his life was in danger. They must ask themselves if the shooting was done in a moment of anger while drunk and not thinking clearly, and many had suggested that George was drunk at the time, and then this would be manslaughter. However, if they felt the gun was fired because George had a grudge against Michael because of his own wife, then they must find in favour of willful murder. The jury retired for 45 minutes before returning with a verdict of guilty of manslaughter against George Smith. The judge, then addressing George, said he was very lucky that the jury had found in favour of manslaughter, as he felt that this was a case that was very close to murder. He then sentenced George Smith to 15 years penal servitude. I just want to add here that although the judge at the trial mentioned evidence that had been given by Mary Smith, I was not actually able to find any details of this. However, the judge did also state that her evidence was pretty much exactly the same as that of her daughters. I did not find any further details of George after this date, so I do not know which prison he was sent to serve out his sentence or any details of when he was released, but it has to be hoped that he never returned to Hetton or to his wife and family. And sadly, I did not 100% find details of Mary Smith and her family after George was sent to prison. However, it is possible that she remarried and moved away from Hetton-Le-Hole, as I did find one family with children whose names were exactly the same as her children, And I have to admit to hoping that this is the case and that she did not end up in the workhouse. This was a very odd case, but also quite a clear one. It seems that we can be very sure that George, when drunk, was not a very nice man. He was known to badly treat his wife and had threatened to shoot her and others previously. Yet when he was sober, he was described as a quiet, peaceful man, though I'm not sure if the quiet man name really did suit him. So drink, as it often does, played a very big part in this story. And it seems that the idea that his wife was behaving in an improper way with Michael Bainbridge was the main cause of the argument, and that took place that fateful night. Now, obviously, the idea that his wife was behaving improperly with Michael clearly seems to be a figment of George's imagination. The help that Michael had given to Mary Smith when George had been abusive to her had been seen as something entirely different by George, and that had made him want to fight with Michael. Sadly, this got out of hand when he got the fight that he wanted, and the other men got the better of him, and in his anger and the foolish behaviour of Michael in throwing the brick through the window later led him to take the drastic action of shooting out of his window at the man he despised so much and caused his death. Were the jury correct to find him guilty of manslaughter and not murder? Well, to be honest, I think they gave him the benefit of the doubt, believing that he had been kicked by the other men and he was angry, drunk and not thinking straight and did not mean to kill anyone, just firing in a moment of madness. But I have to admit I am leaning towards the idea that he did intend to kill, as he fired from a window some distance away, but still seemed to fire directly into the heart of Michael Bainbridge. But what do you think? Do you think George intended to murder Michael that night and should have been hanged? Or do you think he really did fire the gun by accident? Or maybe you think he was simply drunk and angry after the fight and shot out of the window to scare those who he'd been fighting with? Do you think he was simply a jealous, angry man when he was drunk, and in truth, the other men should have ignored him when he wanted to fight with them, as had they done so, the sad death of Michael Bainbridge may never have occurred? Do you think the jury were correct to find him guilty of manslaughter and was 15 years in prison, long enough for the crime he had committed? Do please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this very sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again next week.